As a side note, ministers talk to each other, and I was having a discussion with a Presbyterian minister one day, and of course, as happens so often, he was a little bit perplexed by where we're coming from religiously. And then I announced to him that really, Unitarian Universalists actually have more faith than Presbyterians. And he said, well, that's impossible. You don't believe in the resurrection and the flesh, and you don't believe in the Trinity and blah, blah, blah. And I said, yes, but we do our offering before folks hear the sermon, so they don't know what they're paying for. I can't remember what he said after that. I'm sure there was something. In 1933, the United States was in the Great Depression. Adolf Hitler ruled Germany, fascism gripped Italy, Stalin ruled Russia. It was a bad time for religious liberals around the world, including American Unitarians. Membership was dropping. Some Unitarian churches were in real financial trouble. A few had even closed their doors permanently. Unitarianism was also and always had been theologically and regionally divided. New England Unitarians were still pretty traditionally Christian, but many Unitarians elsewhere no longer considered God or Jesus relevant. The upper Midwest, particularly this neck of the woods, was a center for non-theistic Unitarian humanists. And in 1933, their leading lights had put together a brochure called the Humanist Manifesto. It was in some ways a brilliant document, but it was also controversial and divisive. Given the theological divisions and the decline in attendance, some people wondered whether Unitarianism could remain relevant or even survive. And to answer such questions, American Unitarian Association leaders in Boston set up what they called a commission of appraisal to study the state of the association and make recommendations for what future steps they might take. To chair the commission, they chose a minister in St. Paul, Minnesota, Frederick May Elliott. Elliott had grown up at the very center of Boston Unitarianism, even receiving his training at Harvard University. Now, he was a theist, but serving in Minnesota, he had learned to talk and listen to Midwestern humanists. He showed that broad theological diversity could work. And he wrote that a Unitarian church was a fellowship of seekers. And of course, that's a phrase we still sometimes use today. Under his leadership, the Commission of Appraisal began by asking the question, has Unitarianism any function in the modern world? And if so, what was that function and how might it be fulfilled? They spent 3 years asking questions, collecting information, looking for answers, and then they published a 400-page report in 1936, and they wrote that American Unitarianisms were riven by deep theological divisions. Some believed in God, some didn't. Many believed in the leadership of Jesus, but others saw no relevance in that concept. 2/3 saw no value in Christian communion. 3/4 saw no value in the idea of petitionary prayer. Others saw no value in the idea of divine forgiveness for one's sins. The tradition was a mix of introverts, extroverts, rationalists, mystics, atheists, and theists. Most of them did believe in a rational approach to faith and that we should back up our beliefs with committed action toward a more just and loving society. The commission concluded that theological diversity was not only unavoidable, it could be turned into a real strength. We could, they wrote, be the leaders of what they called a larger religious liberalism. There are 3 major groups of churches in the United States. They wrote one group is made up of the great historic ritualistic churches, the Greek Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, and other. The second is the body of very conservative, non-liturgical churches, often called fundamentalist. The third group comprises the churches of the free spirit. The witnesses to belief in freedom are many, close quote. 80 years have passed since then, more than that, and some things have changed, but that report's main themes are still relevant. Unitarian Universalists can play an important role in free religious thought. As the commission wrote, the growing points of Unitarianism are the growing points of the progressive elements of religion wherever found. They also proposed a future partnership with the Universalist Church in America. But if that were going to happen, they wrote, Unitarians needed to learn to talk about more than just what we didn't believe. We needed to talk about what we did believe as well, they wrote. And of course, that hasn't changed as much as it might have either. Several good things did come out of the Commission of Appraisal's report. The association tightened its administration and became more efficient. Unitarians began to understand and better accept their theological diversity. And they also started down the 25-year path toward merger with the Universalists. Frederick May Elliott later became president of the American Unitarian Association, and he remained so until after the merger. That merger, of course, came in 1961 after years of meetings between Universalists and Unitarians to thrash out the details. The Universalist Church of America really had no national administrative structure, just what they called independent state conventions. So the new the new Unitarian Universalist Association used the Unitarians' national administrative structure. And they also kept the Unitarians' practice of regular reviews of the state of the association. They created a standing committee in the bylaws called the Commission on Appraisal, and commission members would be elected at our annual convention, General Assembly, to, quote, review any function or activity of the association which will benefit from an independent review, report their conclusions, and make regular recommendations to the General Assembly. Another part of the merger process was creation of our Unitarian Universalist principles, which were written into Article 2 of our bylaws. But those original principles turned out to be just an early step in an ongoing process. A couple of decades later, in the 1980s, we completely rewrote them. Our principles are always subject to change. And in fact, our bylaws require that we do review them every 15 years or so. A lot of religions, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, and different branches of Christianity, just as examples, all use a series of statements to explain the core of their religious outlook. Unitarian Universalists are no different in that respect. What is different is that both Unitarianism and Universalism are progressive faiths which intentionally learn and evolve over time. And that makes it particularly difficult for us to come up with a simple set of statements that convey what we're about. Both Unitarianism and Universalism have been producing such lists of statements for over 200 years. They're only good for a few decades before they get changed again. So, one of the first things the new Unitarian Universalist Association did was, you guessed it, set up a commission to examine the similarities and differences among us. And that commission's report, titled The Free Church in a Changing World, identified 6 basic theological currents: liberal Christianity, deism, mysticism, religious humanism, naturalism, and existentialism. That was in 1961. Their conclusion was that our religion, quote, is characterized by openness to different theological emphases which flourish in dialogue with one another. We flourish best in dialogue with one another, bouncing ideas off one another. And that same report also summed up the 4 core values of liberal religion in general, and I find these quite useful. First, Rather than spend much time worrying about the afterlife, we focus on character development in the here and now. So instead of the afterlife, we worry about the here and now. Second, we emphasize ethical living and making the world a better place. Third, meaningful community still has to form around a religious base. That is, real community lies, quote, in a religion that strives to transcend individual differences by an inclusive vision and motivation. That's from the report. And fourth, we're committed to democratic process and respect for each individual. Now, mind you, concepts like that are easier to talk about than to actually do. But as Maya Angelou put it, we try to do our best, and when we learn better, do better. So that was pretty much the thinking behind the original Unitarian Universalist principles. But the 1961 version of the principles would be unrecognizable to anyone who joined less than 30 years ago. There were only 6 for one thing. You can read our current principles, 7 principles, in the front of our gray hymnal. They begin, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations," and so on and so forth. Here's the 1961 version. Bear with me. Quote, "In accordance with our corporate purposes, the members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, dedicated to the principles of a free faith, unite in seeking, 1, to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship. 2, to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorial, summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. 3, to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships. 4, to implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community based on ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace. 5, to serve the needs of member churches and fellowships, to organize new churches and fellowships, and to extend and strengthen liberation. And finally, 6, to encourage cooperation with men of goodwill in every land." Now, you could devote a whole sermon just to the differences between our 1961 principles and the ones we have now. Basically, the 1961 version summed up our purposes and our sources, as well as our ideals, all in one rather wordy package. They strongly centered our roots in the Jewish and Christian traditions, and they used the sexist language of that time. And they were not as big a deal as our 7 principles later became when the Unitarian Universalist Association published its first hymn book in 1964. And here it is, the old blue hymnal. Those principles were not in it. Then over the next 15 years, people began to notice the sexism and gender-based language, not just in the principles, but in the hymn, all through the hymnal. So in the late 1970s, and still another review of our practices, the association set up the Women and Religion Committee to look at sexist language in our hymn book and the bylaws. And while they were at it, they took a hard look at the principles as well. One result was rewriting quite a few of our hymns in general gender neutral language. We've been rewriting hymns for sensitivity purposes for more than 40 years. It is not something that just started in the last year or two. That came out, the supplement with the gender neutral language came out as a paperback supplement, the little green guy, to our hymn book. And that was also, I have to tell you, one of the things that first attracted me to Unitarian Universalism 35 years ago. I thought, wow, just because these guys have always been doing something a certain way, they don't necessarily make you keep doing it that way when it doesn't work anymore. And as a visitor, I was really impressed. We also went into a long process of rewriting the principles themselves. That opened up a whole other can of worms. You Christians worried that we would neglect our roots in that religious tradition. Humanists, mystics, and others thought we shouldn't favor one religious tradition over another. It turned into a heated discussion, which is, of course, something else that we do all the time. They set up a blue ribbon committee, one more committee, which sent questionnaires out to the congregations for feedback, which they got a lot of. They summed that all up, asked for more comments on that summary, and issued a comprehensive report at our 1984 General Assembly. And that set off a major floor fight. Something else we do all the time. People argued over whether God should even be mentioned, what tradition should and shouldn't be mentioned. Everybody had their opinion, and everybody wanted their say. The rewriting process dominated that General Assembly. But the nice thing about democratic process, sloppy though it is that if you stay with it, it does usually work out in the end. If you don't give up on it or don't try disempowering people. Everybody had to compromise some. That's the way democracy works, but they finally produced a result that almost everyone could live with. The new 7 principles did not mention God, but they did add a set of sources that honored our Jewish and Christian heritage, as well as humanism, prophetic wisdom, world religion, and so on. And they listed the association's purposes in a different section of the bylaws. And I think it's also worth mentioning that where the 1961 principles reflected the writings of Frederick May Elliott and Universalist theologian Clarence Skinner, the new principles were strongly influenced by the covenantal theology of James Luther Adams. And I talked about him a few weeks ago. And other Unitarian Universalist theologians, such as Alice Blair Wesley, also wrote books tracing covenantal theology back to our 17th century forebears. And when our new hymn book came out in 1993, again, it contained the principles and purposes, the new ones, right at the front, but we still were not done. In the early 1990s, and if you've been around long enough and remember the first edition of this gray hymnal, they realized they needed to include one more source, which had been neglected: spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions. And that's how you can tell this is not a 1993 edition, it's a newer one. That 6th source was voted in, but not in time to make it into the hymn book. So the first edition of our gray hymnal was out of date before it was even published. But you know what? I can't think of a better example of how we go about religion. 160 years ago, someone in California asked Unitarian minister Thomas Starr King where Unitarians stood on an important issue of that day, and he replied, "We don't stand, we move." And it would probably be closer to the truth to say we evolve. It was true then, and it's true of Unitarian Universalists today. We don't stand, we evolve. So come evolve with us. It can be a beautiful thing, if sometimes a little uncomfortable, and occasionally it causes something to be left out of the first edition of something. But human perception is limited. Time and again, there have been ideas that seemed radical at the time: religious freedom, the abolition of slavery, the right of women to vote and own property, racial integration, gay rights, transgender rights. At one time, most right-thinking people considered every one of those ideas a blight on society. Every one of them. Time passed, and now those same ideas are becoming so universally accepted, people barely remember that anyone even did oppose them. And that's one reason some people don't like to look too closely at history. They don't want to see those mistakes. Society's vision slowly does improve as time passes. And if we want tomorrow to be better than today, we need to evolve with it. To me, religious living is not about ancient scriptures or rituals or creeds or words handed down from some religious authority. It's about honesty, humility, struggling to be your best self, changing your mind, and evolving as new facts and understanding come to light, which is really difficult. We cannot read the future. Our distant descendants will know things that we don't even dream of right now. And a set of religious principles should, I think, in some small way, be a door to a better way of being in the world. And that includes our 7 principles. They're meant to be relational promises, not a creedal statement of belief. That's exactly why our associations bylaws mandate that we do re-examine them every 15 years or so. If we're true to our values, we'll be arguing about our principles as long as there is a Unitarian Universalist association. And frankly, that does give me a funny feeling. As I get older, change does get more uncomfortable. Personal improvement is sure as heck uncomfortable. But to me, religion is most beautiful when it's written in living hearts, not on stone tablets. Amen. May it be so.